What if one of the largest and wealthiest churches in the world was built on a foundation that can be tested, examined, and verified? And what if, when scholars actually did that, the results were devastating? This is not speculation. This is not anti-religious bias. What you're about to hear comes from Egyptian scholars at the University of Chicago, from geneticists at some of the most respected institutions in the world, from the church's own historical records, and, perhaps most damning of all, from official essays quietly published by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints itself. Essays that most of its own members have never read. There are moments in history when an institution becomes so large, so powerful, so deeply embedded in the lives of millions, that questioning it feels almost unthinkable. The Mormon Church has over 17 million members worldwide. It controls an estimated $250 billion in assets. It operates temples on every inhabited continent. And for nearly 2 centuries, it has told its members a very specific story. A story about golden plates, about a prophet who could translate ancient languages by the power of God, about a lost civilization of Israelites who sailed to the Americas and became the ancestors of the Native American peoples. It is a beautiful story. It is a compelling story. And for millions of people, it is the story around which they have built their entire lives, their marriages, their families, their identities, their understanding of eternity itself. But what happens when that story collides with Egyptian papyri that can now be read? What happens when geneticists map the DNA of indigenous peoples across the Western Hemisphere? What happens when archaeologists spend decades searching for even a single artifact, a single inscription, a single city from a civilization that supposedly numbered in the millions? What happens when the prophet's own handwritten accounts of his most sacred experience contradict each other? And what happens when the church's own records reveal that the man they call a prophet was secretly marrying teenage girls and other men's wives while publicly denying it? What happens is what thousands of faithful, devout, lifelong Latter-day Saints describe as the moment the shelf breaks. That is their phrase for it. The shelf. The mental shelf where they have been placing doubts for years, sometimes for decades, telling themselves there must be an answer, telling themselves to just have faith, telling themselves that God will explain it someday. And then one day, one piece of evidence too many lands on that shelf, and the entire thing collapses. Today, we are going to lay out the 5 biggest reasons, not opinions, not feelings, not theological disagreements, but concrete, documented, verifiable reasons why a growing number of scholars, historians, and former believers have concluded that the foundational claims of the Mormon Church cannot be true. We are going to follow the evidence. We are going to look at what the church itself has been forced to admit. And we are going to let you decide. Let us begin with the single most devastating piece of evidence, the one that even some believing Mormon scholars have struggled to explain. It involves a set of ancient Egyptian papyri, a young man who claimed he could read them, and a translation that turned out to be spectacularly, verifiably wrong. Part 1. The Book of Abraham. The translation that wasn't. In the summer of 1835, a traveling exhibition arrived in Kirtland, Ohio, carrying 4 Egyptian mummies and several rolls of ancient papyrus. Joseph Smith, who had already claimed the miraculous ability to translate the Book of Mormon from golden plates using divine instruments, was immediately captivated. He purchased the collection and announced to his followers something extraordinary. These papyri, he declared, contain the writings of the biblical patriarch Abraham, written by Abraham's own hand. Think about that claim for a moment. A man in rural Ohio in 1835, with no training in any ancient language, looked at Egyptian hieroglyphics and announced that he could read them and that what they said was scripture, a direct personal account from one of the most important figures in the Bible. He then produced a text that became known as the Book of Abraham, which was eventually canonized as part of the Pearl of Great Price, one of the 4 standard works of scripture in the Latter-day Saint tradition. To this day, it is taught in Sunday school. To this day, it is considered the Word of God. Joseph did not just produce a text, he also produced detailed explanations of 3 Egyptian illustrations, which the church calls facsimiles. He identified specific figures in these drawings. This one is Abraham. This one is the angel of the Lord. This one is a sacrificial altar. This figure represents a specific Egyptian god. He was remarkably specific. And for more than a century, there was no way to verify any of it, because Egyptology was still in its infancy, and the original papyri were believed to have been destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Then, in 1966, everything changed. Fragments of the original Joseph Smith papyri were rediscovered in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. They had not been destroyed. They had been sitting in a museum collection for decades. And now, unlike in 1835, the world had professional Egyptologists who could actually read ancient Egyptian. The papyri were examined, translated, and analyzed by scholars from multiple institutions. The result was not ambiguous. It was not a matter of interpretation. The papyri were identified as a common Egyptian funerary text known as the Breathing Permit of Hor, dating to roughly the 1st century before Christ. Far too late to have been written by Abraham, who according to biblical chronology would have lived nearly 2,000 years earlier. The text had nothing to do with Abraham. It had nothing to do with sacrifice. It had nothing to do with anything Joseph Smith had claimed. It was a standard document placed with mummies to help guide the deceased in the afterlife, and copies of very similar texts have been found across Egypt. Robert Rittner, one of the foremost Egyptologists at the University of Chicago, and a specialist in precisely this type of Egyptian religious text, examined Joseph Smith's translations in detail. His conclusion was unequivocal. Not a single one of Joseph's interpretations of the facsimiles is correct. The figures Joseph identified as Abraham, as a priest, as specific deities, all wrong. The narrative Joseph constructed from these illustrations, entirely fabricated. Rittner published extensive academic work on this subject, and no credentialed Egyptologist, including those who are or were members of the church, has been able to produce a credible defense of Joseph's translation. This is not a matter of faith versus science in some abstract philosophical sense. This is a man who said he could read a specific document, who told the world exactly what that document said, and who was later proven, by the very document he claimed to have translated, to have been completely wrong. If Joseph Smith could not translate the Egyptian papyri, and there is no legitimate scholarly dispute on this point, then on what basis should anyone trust that he accurately translated the golden plates of the Book of Mormon, plates that conveniently no longer exist for anyone to examine? The Church has attempted several defenses over the years. Some apologists have argued that the surviving papyri fragments are not the specific ones Joseph used, that the real source material was on a longer scroll that was indeed destroyed. But this argument contradicts the physical evidence. The fragments match the facsimiles published in the Book of Abraham. Others have suggested that perhaps the papyri were merely a catalyst for revelation, that Joseph received the text through inspiration rather than literal translation. But this contradicts Joseph's own words and the historical record, which clearly describe a translation process. And it raises an uncomfortable question. If the papyri were just a catalyst, why did Joseph produce detailed, specific, and entirely wrong explanations of the Egyptian illustrations? The Church's own Gospel Topics essay on the Book of Abraham, published quietly on its website, acknowledges that the relationship between the papyri and the text is not straightforward. But it stops short of admitting the obvious, which is that the translation does not hold up under any form of scholarly scrutiny. And most members have never read that essay. For many former Latter-day Saints, the Book of Abraham is the single item that broke their shelf. It is concrete, it is testable, it is verifiable, and it fails the test completely. Part 2. A civilization that left no trace. If someone told you that a great civilization had existed for 1,000 years across a vast continent, that it had built cities and temples, forged weapons of steel, raised horses and elephants, cultivated wheat and barley, produced silk, driven chariots, and fought wars involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers, your first question might be, where is the evidence? Where are the ruins? Where are the artifacts? Where are the bones? The Book of Mormon describes exactly such a civilization. According to its narrative, a family of Israelites left Jerusalem around 600 years before Christ, sailed across the ocean, and arrived in the Americas, where their descendants split into two rival nations, the Nephites and the Lamanites. Over the next 1,000 years, these peoples supposedly built a complex society with all the hallmarks of the ancient Near East. The book describes great cities. It describes massive battles, including a final apocalyptic conflict at a place called Cumorah, in which hundreds of thousands of warriors perished. It mentions horses, elephants, steel swords, chariots, wheat, barley, silk, coins, and large-scale agriculture. Every single one of these claims runs directly into the wall of what archaeology, biology, and history have actually established about the pre-Columbian Americas. Let us start with the animals. Horses were indeed present in the Americas. Millions of years ago, They went extinct on the continent roughly 10,000 years before Christ and were not reintroduced until the Spanish arrived in the 15th and 16th centuries. The Book of Mormon places horses in the Americas during a period when, according to every fossil record we have, they simply did not exist there. Elephants present a similar problem. Mammoths and mastodons once roamed the Americas, but were extinct thousands of years before the Book of Mormon timeline begins. Then there is steel. The Book of Mormon describes steel swords and other metal objects in the Americas centuries before Christ. But the peoples of the pre-Columbian Americas did not produce steel. Iron smelting and steel production were technologies that developed in the Old World and were not present in the Western Hemisphere until European contact. The metallurgy that did exist among indigenous American civilizations, gold, silver, copper, does not match what the Book of Mormon describes. Wheat and barley were Old World crops, not cultivated in the Americas during the relevant period. Silk is another Old World product. Chariots require wheeled vehicles, and while the concept of the wheel was known in Mesoamerica for small objects like toys, it was never developed into functional wheeled transport, in part because there were no suitable draft animals to pull such vehicles, because there were no horses. But perhaps the most striking absence is the complete lack of any physical evidence for the civilizations themselves. We are not talking about a small, isolated community that might leave few traces. We are talking about nations described in the Book of Mormon as having populations in the hundreds of thousands, with cities and temples and a literate culture that supposedly kept records on metal plates. The final battle at Cumorah alone is described as involving at least 230,000 warriors. To put this in perspective, archaeologists have found abundant evidence for civilizations that were far smaller and far older. The Maya, the Aztec, the Inca, the Mississippian mound builders, all left extensive archaeological records, including cities, inscriptions, artifacts, and human remains. We can find evidence of human activity in the Americas going back more than 15,000 years. But after nearly 2 centuries of searching, not a single artifact, not a single inscription in Reformed Egyptian, not a single city, not a single coin, not a single weapon, not a single fragment of a golden plate has been found that corresponds to anything described in the Book of Mormon. Nothing. The Smithsonian Institution has been asked about this so many times that it eventually prepared a formal statement declaring that it has found no connection between the archaeology of the New World and the subject matter of the Book of Mormon. The National Geographic Society has issued similar statements. Apologists for the Church have proposed a number of theories to explain this absence. Some suggest a limited geography model, arguing that the events of the Book of Mormon took place in a small area, perhaps in Mesoamerica, rather than across the entire hemisphere. Others have suggested that what Joseph Smith called horses were actually tapirs, that steel might refer to a different type of metal, that barley could be a reference to a wild grass that vaguely resembles it. These arguments have been described by critics and by some honest observers within the faith as increasingly strained efforts to make the text fit a reality it was never designed to accommodate. The more straightforward explanation, the one accepted by essentially all non-Mormon archaeologists and historians, is that the Book of Mormon is a work of 19th century fiction that reflects the knowledge, assumptions, and imagination of its time, including popular theories that circulated in Joseph Smith's era about lost tribes of Israel having migrated to the Americas. Part 3. The DNA. Evidence. For most of its history, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints taught its members a very specific claim about the indigenous peoples of the Americas. The Book of Mormon itself was presented as the history of their ancestors. The Lamanites, one of the 2 major groups in the book, were said to be the principal ancestors of the American Indians. This was not a fringe interpretation. This was the Church's own introduction to the Book of Mormon for decades. Prophets and apostles repeated it from the pulpit for over a century. It was central to the Church's missionary program, particularly in Latin America and among Native American communities, where potential converts were told that they were literally reading the history of their own people. Then came the era of modern genetics. Beginning in the late 20th century and accelerating rapidly in the 21st, scientists conducted extensive DNA studies on indigenous populations across the Americas, from the Arctic to Patagonia. The results were clear, consistent, and devastating to the traditional Mormon narrative. The genetic ancestry of Native Americans traces overwhelmingly to East Asia, consistent with migration across the Bering Land Bridge thousands of years ago. Mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome DNA, and autosomal DNA studies all point to the same conclusion. The genetic heritage of indigenous Americans is Asian, not Middle Eastern. There is no significant trace of ancient Israelite DNA in pre-Columbian indigenous populations. This was not a single study that might be questioned. This was the cumulative result of hundreds of studies conducted by geneticists at universities and research institutions around the world. The evidence was not ambiguous. The indigenous peoples of the Americas are not descended from a family that left Jerusalem in 600 BC. The church's response was telling. In 2006, quietly and without public announcement, the introduction to the Book of Mormon was changed. Where it had previously described the Lamanites as the principal ancestors of the American Indians, the new wording described them as being among the ancestors of the American Indians. It was a small change in wording, but it represented a massive theological retreat. Generations of members had been taught one thing. The science contradicted it. And instead of acknowledging the contradiction openly, the church simply altered the text and hoped most members would not notice. In 2014, the church published a gospel topics essay titled Book of Mormon and DNA Studies. In it, the church acknowledged that the majority of Native American DNA traces to Asian origins. The essay attempted to argue that a small Israelite population arriving in the Americas could have been genetically swamped, that their DNA signature could have been diluted beyond detection over centuries of intermarriage with larger existing populations. This is a theoretically possible scenario, but it is a dramatic departure from what the church had taught for over 150 years. It essentially asks members to accept that the central narrative of the Book of Mormon involved a group so small that they left no detectable genetic trace, while simultaneously believing the book's descriptions of massive civilizations and hundreds of thousands of warriors. You cannot have it both ways. Either the Nephites and Lamanites were the major civilizations described in the Book of Mormon, in which case they should have left a clear genetic and archaeological record, or they were a tiny, insignificant group that disappeared into the existing population without a trace, in which case the Book of Mormon's own descriptions of their scale and significance are fiction. For many believers who encounter this evidence, the DNA issue is not just about genetics, it is about trust. The church taught something for generations. The science proved it wrong. And instead of being honest about it, the leadership quietly changed the text and published an essay that most members were never directed to read. Part 4. The First Vision That Kept Changing. If you have ever spoken to a Latter-day Saint missionary, you have almost certainly heard the story of the first vision. It is the founding narrative of the entire faith. In 1820, a 14-year-old farm boy named Joseph Smith, confused by the competing claims of the various Christian churches in his area, went into a grove of trees near his home in Palmyra, New York, and prayed to God to know which church was true. In response, God the Father and Jesus Christ appeared to him personally, standing in a pillar of light above his head. They told him that all existing churches were wrong, that their creeds were an abomination, and that he should join none of them. It is a powerful story. It is the story that every missionary tells to every potential convert. It is the story on which the entire claim of the restoration rests. The idea that God personally intervened to call Joseph Smith as a prophet and to re-establish the true church on earth. If this event happened as described, then Joseph Smith was chosen by God. If it did not, then the entire foundation of the church crumbles. Here is the problem. Joseph Smith told this story multiple times over the course of his life, and the versions are significantly different from each other. The earliest known account, written in Joseph's own hand in 1832, describes a very different experience from the official version the church teaches today. In that 1832 account, Joseph says he already knew which church was true before he prayed. He had already concluded that no church was correct. He describes seeing only one divine being, the Lord, not two. There is no mention of God the Father appearing as a separate person. This is a critical theological distinction because the appearance of two separate beings is the foundation of the Mormon doctrine that God the Father and Jesus Christ are two distinct physical persons, which sets Mormonism apart from virtually all of mainstream Christianity. In another early account, relayed by Joseph to a visitor in 1835, he describes seeing not God the Father and Jesus, but an angel or angels. In yet another recounting, the details shift again regarding who appeared and what was said. The version that became the official narrative, the one with both God the Father and Jesus Christ appearing together, was not written until 1838, nearly 2 decades after the event supposedly occurred, and it was not published widely until 1842. By that point, Joseph's theology had evolved dramatically. He had moved from something closer to mainstream Protestant Christianity toward a radically new theology that required God the Father and Jesus Christ to be separate, embodied beings. The pattern is hard to ignore. The story grew more elaborate and more theologically significant over time as Joseph's doctrinal claims expanded. What began as a personal spiritual experience involving one being gradually became a theophany involving 2 separate gods, a change that just happened to align perfectly with the evolving theology Joseph needed to justify. Now, defenders of the church will argue that it is normal for someone to emphasize different aspects of an experience when retelling it at different times. And that is true, to a point. But we are not talking about minor variations in emphasis. We are talking about the number and identity of the divine beings who appeared. That is not a detail you forget or rephrase. If God the Father and Jesus Christ both appeared to you in a pillar of light, the single most important event in the history of your religion, you do not tell the story years later and accidentally leave out God the Father. The Church's own Gospel Topics essay on the first vision acknowledges the existence of multiple accounts and attempts to frame them as complementary rather than contradictory. But for many people who examine the accounts side by side, the impression is unavoidable. The story was not remembered differently at different times. It was constructed differently at different times, refined and improved to serve the evolving needs of a growing religious movement. Part 5. The Secret Life of the Prophet. There is perhaps no aspect of Joseph Smith's life that causes more pain, more shock, and more anger among Latter-day Saints who encounter the full historical record than his practice of polygamy. Not because polygamy itself is unknown in the Church's history. Most members are aware that early Mormons practiced plural marriage. What they are not prepared for, in most cases, are the specific details of how Joseph Smith himself practiced it. According to careful historical research, including the Church's own Gospel Topics essay on plural marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo, published in 2014, Joseph Smith married between 30 and 40 women during his lifetime. That number alone is striking. But the details are far more troubling. Several of Joseph's plural wives were teenagers. The youngest confirmed case is Helen Mar Kimball, who was 14 years old at the time of her marriage to Joseph. She later wrote that she was told the marriage would ensure the eternal salvation of her entire family, a claim that, regardless of whether the marriage was consummated, placed extraordinary religious pressure on a child. Perhaps even more disturbing to many people is the practice of polyandry. Joseph married multiple women who were already legally married to other living men. These were not widows. These were not abandoned women. These were women with husbands, and in some cases Joseph sent those husbands away on missions before or after marrying their wives. The ethical implications of this practice are difficult to reconcile with the image of a divinely appointed prophet acting under God's direction. And throughout all of this, Joseph publicly denied the practice. He stood before his congregation and denied that he was practicing polygamy, even as he was actively engaged in it. He allowed the destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor, a newspaper that sought to expose his secret marriages, an act that directly led to his arrest and ultimately to his death at Carthage jail in 1844. The official church narrative presents his death as martyrdom, but the immediate cause was the public fury over his suppression of the press and his practice of secret polygamy. For over a century and a half, the church downplayed, obscured, and in many cases simply did not teach these details to its members. Generations of Latter-day Saints grew up with a sanitized image of Joseph Smith as a faithful monogamous husband to Emma. The 2014 essays changed that, but even those essays were published without fanfare, buried on the church's website, and never incorporated into standard Sunday school curriculum in a meaningful way. Most members discover them through outside sources, often in the process of a faith crisis. The issue here is not simply that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. The issue is the pattern, the secrecy, the denial, the manipulation, the exploitation of religious authority to pressure women and girls into marriages, and the institutional cover-up that lasted for generations. For many former members, this is not a historical curiosity. This is a betrayal of trust, by a man who claimed to speak for God, and by an institution that claims to be led by continuing revelation but could not bring itself to tell the truth about its own founder until public pressure made silence impossible. 5 pieces of evidence. Egyptian papyri that were translated wrong. A 1,000-year civilization that left nothing behind. DNA that points to Asia, not Jerusalem, a founding vision that kept changing, and a prophet who lied about his secret marriages to teenagers and other men's wives. None of these points come from enemies of the church. They come from Egyptian scholars, geneticists, archaeologists, and from the church's own historical records and official essays. They come from the evidence. If you are watching this and you are a believing Latter-day Saint, I am not asking you to abandon your faith in this moment. I am asking you to do what Joseph Smith himself reportedly told investigators to do. Seek the truth. Read the church's own gospel topics essays. Read the original documents. Look at the papyri translations. Look at the DNA studies. And ask yourself an honest question. If this evidence were presented to you about any other church, any other prophet, any other scripture, would you accept it? Or would you see it for what it is? The truth does not need to be protected from investigation. The truth invites investigation, and if the Mormon Church's claims are true, they should be able to withstand every question you throw at them. So throw them, and pay very close attention to what comes back. If this is the first time you are hearing any of this, leave a comment below and tell me which of these 5 points hit you the hardest. And if you have been through this process yourself, if your shelf has broken, share your story. Because somewhere out there, someone is watching this right now, and they need to know they are not alone. If this video opened your eyes, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We publish investigative content like this regularly, looking at the claims major religious institutions make and whether the evidence supports them. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. And if you are a believing member who disagrees, I welcome your response in the comments. Bring your evidence and let us have the conversation.